Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by Velos Advisory, sponsored by Ernst & Young in Greece under the auspices of the NED Executive Directors Club in Greece. The NED Club, established in late 2019, is the association for the non-executive board members of listed and unlisted companies operating in Greece. Based on national and international corporate governance good practices, the NED Club aims to facilitate peer interaction, to promote the role of directors, and to develop professional competence of its members and raise the corporate governance standards of Greek companies through the boards. The NED Club is supported in its activities by Ernst & Young in Greece, and is also a full member of the European Confederation of the Directors Associations, also known as ECODA. Undoubtedly, there is a very growing interest of various groups, such as shareholders, bondholders, regulators, employees, to name a few, to the societal footprint of companies, whether these companies are listed or not. Such interest has given rise to how companies and their boards manage what has come to be known as the acronym ESG, environmental, social, and government issues. Up to the COVID year, the focus has been mainly on the environmental issues, but during the pandemic, the societal issues surfaced, while corporate scandals and compliance risks still caught the stakeholders' attention. Investors, on the other hand, now more than ever, integrate ESG when they're making their investment decisions and prefer those companies who follow high standards of corporate governance. Increasingly, on the other hand, corporates across all markets recognize the importance of ESG in managing their strategy and their reputation and see it as part of their toolkit in differentiating themselves from their competitors. So in this context, NED Club has joined forces with market experts like Ernst & Young and Velos Advisory to offer this webinar, so to educate and support directors in their roles. This will be the second in a series of webinars that the NED Club will be offering to the market over the next few months. Industry experts will provide insights on the impact of ESG on the corporate and investor landscape. We will discuss the importance of stewardship and engagement and the role of the board's ESG oversight. On that note, and on behalf of the NED Club President, Lida Kodogiannis, I would like to welcome you, our speakers, our panelists, and I will now pass to Emilia Varfis, CEO of Velos Advisory. Thank you, Emilia.
Thanks, Natasha, and hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar organized by Velos Advisory on the rise of the ESG megatrend. On behalf of Lida, who Natasha very kindly replaced, she has a bad case of laryngitis, so she's watching us, but she unfortunately can't speak to make the opening. So thank you, Natasha, for doing that. With the events that are unfolding around the world, such as the extraordinary impact of the COVID-19 pandemic to the global economy and the environmental developments which can no longer be ignored, a spotlight has been pointed on ESG. So ESG is no longer a trend, it's become a mega trend. We're experiencing a sustainability revolution, and to quote Larry Fink, sustainability will be the lens from which we view everything in 10 years. So what does this mean? Managing governance and sustainability issues through a box-ticking exercise is no longer sufficient. It's imperative the companies tell their story and present it from a long-term perspective. As a result, never before has engagement been more critical. To this end, we have a team of experts invited for this panel across all fields to provide insights on how corporates need to address ESG in their day-to-day business, in their deliberations with their boards, and in their disclosures. And kicking off this webinar, we've got two presentations from EY and Investor Update, who have both undertaken some very insightful surveys, and we're very pleased that they can share these findings with us and hopefully give you some interesting facts on investor perspectives and their expectations from corporates, and in turn provide some insights on the corporate landscape and how it's evolving. Just for logistics, we're going to allow for a Q&A from the audience at the end of these two presentations. So if you have any, please write them to us. And then I'll let Chiara Conti, Director of Climate Change and Sustainability Services from EY, present on how ESG performance will shape the future and why investors are making ESG an imperative for COVID-19 and beyond. Chiara, over to you.
Thank you, Emilia. I'm very excited to be part of this panel. I'll be sharing some insights from our latest global survey on ESG, investor survey, hopefully giving participants valuable information, but also trigger some discussion for the panel today. So I'll start with the main findings, and then at the end I'll close with some recommended next steps, and obviously we can take questions, as Emilia said. So given the vast majority of other surveys as well, it's pretty much clear nowadays that investors have placed really big emphasis on ESG. Now, we are doing this survey for the past 5 years. So what we've seen in the first, let's say, part of our questionnaire is that although the percentage remains really high on how investors are evaluating this information, both formally structured and informally, so it's close to 97, 98%, what has changed and is really interesting during the past 2 years is the percentage of those who now conduct a structure assessment of this information. So they're looking for robust information around both environmental and social issues, but also governance issues. So this is one major change that we see for 2020. This survey is important to point out that it was carried out in 2020 during the pandemic, so it takes into consideration all these effects from COVID. Now, moving on from the overall, let's say, focus that they place on ESG, what we find very interesting, and this is something that has only been shown in the latest survey, is that investors are really focusing on climate change. They're focusing on climate change both from a risk perspective, but also from an opportunity perspective. So what we're seeing is that they're really embracing the Financial Stability Board's task force on climate-related financial disclosures. So they're really looking for this type of information in ESG disclosures. Now, specifically, we see that more than 2/3 of investors surveyed said that they make significant use of TCFD disclosures, and 78, more than 3/4 in essence, use TCFD information, say that it has a significant impact on their investment decision making. Now, just a very quick note on what TCFD actually is. So it's framed around 4 specific areas. So governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. And what the Financial Stability Board is looking for is to understand how companies are integrating climate change, again, both from a risk and an opportunity perspective, to the overall governance. So what is the board oversight for climate change? What is the management's role for that? How it is incorporated in the strategy, again, risks and opportunities, the impact it has on the business, the resilience of the organization, and how the strategy is ready to adapt and mitigate to climate change, but also very importantly, how incorporated climate change is into the risk management framework. So identifying and assessing climate risks. We'll deep dive into that in a moment. And very importantly, also the metrics and targets that companies are using to monitor their performance and their progress against climate change. So these are the 4 key areas. Now, if we focus a bit on the risks, we'll see that the investors surveyed have emphasized on the fact that risk management is the area that is least developed in these disclosures. So we see companies using metrics, we see some references in their strategies around climate change, we see references on governance, not very high, but again, the risk management seems to be the least developed area. Now, what are these risks in essence? So we have 2 types of risks regarding climate change. We have the physical risks, which are also categorized into the acute and chronic risks, so extreme weather events on the one hand, and chronic events on the other, but also very importantly, and specifically for some sectors, we see the transition risks. So risks stemming from the regulations, risks stemming from customer demands, customer changes in their consumer attitudes, technology risks, and reputational risks. So all these are very important to investors. And at the end of the day, it seems that during the latest survey, it seems that they're more dissatisfied than what they used to be in the past on these disclosures. So they need more information on these risks in all three pillars, so environmental, social, and governance. So you can see the change between 2018 and 2020 on how investors think that companies adequately disclose this type of risks. Now, again, I want to really emphasize this, and I think it's important for companies looking forward on how to integrate ESG, that it's not just the risk perspective. All that's very important is the long-term value creation in that context of ESG integration. So we see that also in this survey. So investors are missing information on how companies are creating this intangible value, and that is value that is stemming from non-financial capitals like the human capital, intellectual capital, social capital, and natural capital. So they're lacking metrics, they're lacking disclosures on how companies are measuring the way they create share value and the way that they create long-term value. And this is an important point, and it's very much related also to the future of sustainability reporting. So telling the story of not just what your performance is, what your output is, but what is the outcome of that performance, how you create value across environmental, social, and economic aspects. So the main, let's say, challenge that investors have pinpointed through this survey is that there is a lot of disconnect, and this links to what I just said, the disconnect between the mainstream financial information and the ESG disclosure. So the link between how sustainability affects financially the company itself is still missing. There's also lack of real-time information. Usually companies are a bit more late in disclosing this ESG reports. So the trend is to bring this closely to the reference year of the report. There is also, as previously mentioned, lack of information on how they create long-term value. And this all links to the lack of materiality. So materiality is not a new concept, is rather old, especially from the financial perspective. But what is really important for ESG integration is to understand that this concept, and it's part of the discussion now for the non-financial disclosure directive and the consultation for the new version, this concept has to do a lot with the concept of double materiality. So companies first need to understand the impacts that they create externally, so an inside-out perspective. What are the most significant economic impacts? What are the most significant environmental impacts for your sector, for your business model? And then bring that in, so an outside-in perspective on how this impacts, how the way you affect your stakeholders creates operational and financial impacts for the company itself. So this is a very, very important concept that is it's not exactly missing because most of the reporting frameworks incorporate this principle, but a more integrated approach into materiality is what is missing in terms of investor focus. And also very important, the lack of forward-looking disclosures. So we're used to looking back in, let's say, financial statements. There's always the previous year that we're referring to and how well companies did in terms of their performance. But when we speak about sustainability, this is a forward-looking concept. So how does the company contribute either economically, socially, or environmentally to the UN SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals? So you need to have some information on your forward-looking perspective when you're disclosing ESG. Now, another interesting finding has to do with the need for more robust data, and this is very much linked to the need for third-party assurance across this ESG information. So we find investors wanting more robust assurance in terms of planning for climate risks, but also in terms of processes and controls on ESG reporting. Now, very few words from my side on what we think investors are looking for in the future, and we're very eager to see that in our next survey, which will be launched very soon. Has to do with three main areas. So one is this connection, to improve the connection between non-financial and financial information. Again, the key here is materiality, and what we find is that it requires a lot of integrated thinking within the organization itself. So the report is just a reflection of what is going on inside. If the silos break down within different departments, then this link between how one department might affect financial information will be much more evident. Now, the other trend that we see is that companies need to build a more robust approach when it comes to climate change risks and opportunities. And we have a separate survey on that. I won't take your time, but one very important point is that this climate change aspect, again, it's a forward-looking discussion. So we need to have specific scenarios to understand how climate change will affect the company or the sector. So this scenario analysis is missing heavily, even from companies that are following TCFD. So bringing in actual climate scenarios and understand in the short, medium, and long term how climate change, again, physical and transition risks will affect the company is very important. And just a final remark from my side, the data again needs to be more robust. So what we see here as a next step for companies is to work closely with departments like the finance department, the CFO, the CRO has a very, very important role to play on building processes that are robust in terms of accuracy and completeness when it comes to non-financial information. So these are some key action areas. I'm happy to take any questions or take some offline as well. So thank you very much for the time.
Yara, thank you. I think, and we're going to touch on it later as well, ESG is starting to bring a big trend about combining the teams, as you said, as well, from within the organizations. Have you seen a difference with your clients in terms of have invested demands triggered a different approach to how they're managing ESG disclosures?
Yes, definitely. I would say that the two most important areas where we see clients feeling not as ready as they would want to be is the integration into the governance structure and also the integration into the risk management process. So these were either not done at all or done in a more informal way. So some companies very mature might have a list of KPIs to monitor and targets, but they were missing the, how this was integrated in their governance and risk management framework. So I think these are two important points that we see moving forward.
Perfect. Well, I don't see that we have any questions at the moment, but we'll see if they come up along the way. Let's move over to Archie from Investor Update. Andrew Archer, we know him as Archie. He's the head of ESG Advisory at Investor Update, who will provide an overview on a white paper that Investor Update has done, which puts together, it's a detailed perception study examining market trends, both from the eyes of a corporate and an investor. So Archie, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having us to Velos EY and the Ned Club. It's great to be a part of it, and welcome to everyone online. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone in Europe, in the US. Both of you. I will share my screen now, and in order to get my presentation working, Chiara had the benefit of starting like that. Does that? Can I just check the presentation works, Amelia? Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. So yes, as described, I'm the partner and head of ESG Advisory at Investor Update, and we are a shareholder intelligence firm. That's the root of what we do, and we've grown in response to market demands, covering a number of areas of market intelligence and shareholder intelligence. proxy solicitation and investor perception work into ESG. And ESG benchmarking and advisory is what I'm responsible for, and we're talking to you today about the work that we've been doing specifically, and to follow on from Chiara's comments there, the rise of the megatrend that is ESG. So there has been fantastic progress made, and there's all kinds of data points that we can look at to see that. I've put some here, this average growth rate of in excess of 15% a year to get to 40 trillion, that in the next 4 years it'll be a third of global AUM that will be represented by ESG. It's a phenomenal trend that we're in, and it's been driven by all kinds of stakeholders, and of course investors are very much a part of that, demanding more data, demanding more disclosure. When we're seeing these frameworks evolve and converge over time, I mentioned there about the cooperation on governance, ESG ratings, which is a particular point that I'm going to be referring to, and of course the voluntary space. And there's this tension or a cooperative move there. We've seen actually it's quite healthy in many regards, a regulatory move, and there's a voluntary effort that's being made to create standards which help the process. And that's all great. It's been impressive, but it's not the whole story. Challenges remain, I say there, and this is what I think we'll talk about in the panel. It's the degree of preparedness by corporates is still not complete. In fact, when I look at the number of corporates that are not Paris aligned, that's a pretty worrying number there. More than 80% still to get in the right place in that regard. On the investor side, to think that more than 50% have a flawed approach. That's one view. Actually, I think it's many views, but it does reflect so much work that needs to be done in this area. That's about the investment side, but then this view about climate change, I think Amelia referenced that it can't be denied, and yes, 30% of CEOs less than that are seriously concerned. We know that that's going to be different now, but it's still too low, and it is going to be influencing over time. And it references in that bullet point this issue of expertise on the board, the qualification of those who are charged to drive forward that change and to be accountable for that change and to make sure that flows through the business. There is so much to do in this area. And now in situations like this, in forums like this, there's always great criticism around data and disclosure, often because there's a lot of truth in that. There's a lot to be desired in being able to create, access and share that data. And it's true that holds back the investment process, and it hampers that evaluation of performance. But it's not an excuse. It's certainly not something that is going to be static, and over time we're going to see that improve quite considerably. These are the challenges as we saw it, and so to meet that challenge, we put together a white paper at the end of last year, which looked all around the issue of ESG. It was taking in all kinds of stakeholders that we could think of. So this is looking at the corporates. We looked at the investors, as you'd expect. We spoke to the rating agencies and the advisors, and only some of those names involved are there. And that informed our thinking about how to set and define a structure for what was happening in ESG. And in recognition that it's a multi-year process, this is something we're doing every year. In fact, we've just begun the process for the second one. But we cover a number of key areas there. And some of those, I'm glad to see, have come out in Chiara's presentation, where you had key themes which will continue to evolve. And some of those are summarized on the left there. The rating agencies is probably the biggest, most consistent complaint that corporates had, and the way that they were trying to operate, and I'll refer to that in a minute. There was a time, obviously, with ESG that it was many corporates would struggle to spell ESG, but let alone to know all the depth and diversity of what it means in terms of strategy, what it means for data extraction from the business, and how to communicate it. And I think, as was just mentioned actually in the opening remarks, far more than just the environmental issues, which are sometimes easier to track. a great deal of focus now around society. This is what we found, that the societal elements are on the rise again, and a need underlying that for that stewardship within governance to be properly represented. It's a huge area, and it's one that is actually quite frightening how little resource there is in some companies. It definitely lends itself to a size bias. Those large companies that are able to deploy people and money in taking on this challenge, or obviously have an advantage straight away. One of the pieces of feedback we got from investors was a desire to see companies begin the journey in any way they can, to start and show willing, and to see that there is going to be it's going to be achieved over time. But just to say in this regard, that it was the sheer breadth of the challenge which corporates are facing currently. So we had some key themes that came out of it. And from an investor perspective, it was about how to access the capital side, and how to be in line to benefit if they were doing well. On the rating agencies, I mentioned there's obviously well documented issues around correlation or lack of between a lot of the scores. There's the frustrations companies felt around the black box approach, or a limited right to reply, the time at which it would take to see the efforts and progress made reflected in those scores. All of these things came through from investors, which is hard, because if they've begun that journey, if they've started to improve their delivery and their performance, they're not seeing that being reflected through one of, as it was, the only way, and in such a high profile way, to gain that traction. That is a challenge. So there were some solutions that came out of that. We had EU regulation. Of course, that standardization continues. It will take longer than I think many people hope, but it will improve the situation. There are routes to go down in terms of an audit of your ESG data. Validating that data is really key, and being able to make it comparable, of course. And as those frameworks converge, then we're going to resolve some of the other problems, but some of the key issues actually won't go away for a while, and some of that makes for quite the challenge. That's the white paper that we wrote and we're updating. It also, as a part of that, played into the next one, which we just completed actually last month, on reporting and disclosure. In other words, going in more detail into this key area. And this is very much a burden for investor relations and Treasury and CSO departments at the moment, because not only are these difficult subjects, but they're also changing very rapidly all the time. The topics are there, and some aspects of that has been covered in Chiara's presentation, so I won't duplicate in that regard, but I will pull out a couple of the issues. I mentioned the society element and how much that is improving. I think it's worth remembering how much there is to go, and obviously I'm going to say diversity is a big part of that. Very patchy and incomplete ways of disclosing and reporting on that basis. And in terms of human rights, to see that only 22% of companies disclose their due diligence in that regard, that means there's a great deal to do, even though we've had the UNGPRF guidelines in place. The first to do it. There is a mechanism in which to do it. For many, I think it is, again, cost and time, but again, that's a challenge for the future. So those are key points that came out of this note, and it will play into what we're talking about. And within this, we have mentioned ESG metrics, and communication is clear. I'm going to say, because of the tone and the direction of this particular webinar, that middle bullet section there on executive advocacy is really key. The degree to which you have true cultural integrity on the board to be able to understand and voice what your plans are and your deliverables are in ESG, and that to be authentic both internally through the culture of the organization, but also externally in regard to investors, but other stakeholders as well. It needs to be seamless. And that, while you could say it takes time, actually there isn't much time. It needs to be believable in this instance. And I think that's a great challenge. And I think it also sits differently than some other metrics of management to be truly consistent internally and externally about what you're trying to achieve. I think that plays into the challenges of the board as described, qualifications of those involved, and also, and this is another key element that came out of our research, about how you tie progress and performance on ESG into executive compensation and long-term incentive structures. And so that's something that we've been working on very much as a business. All of that is in the disclosure paper, and obviously that's available to anybody who wants to be in touch through this webinar. I talked about the various structures and how they're converging over time. I think it's right to say that it will take time, and but at least I think in a positive sense, everyone is broadly trying to pull in the same direction, and that multiple stakeholder feeling I think is true, and I think it's borne out by the way that events like this bring together different kinds of people in order to achieve the same thing. We're still in the pandemic. We have to reference it. My view is very much that it has slowed progress in some of these key areas in terms of how it's slowed many aspects of life, but actually it's also energized ambition to move forward and to change. And I think that means that as we do move through it, we will see an accelerated impact in regards to ESG. Now, our response is, I'd say I help the ESG advisory business, and we meet that challenge through analytics and advisory and a monitoring process, and these details are there, and we can talk about them at another time. But there's a key aspect of this I want to spend some time on. ESG benchmarking particularly. Benchmarking is a phrase used a lot, but the way we look at companies is to give them an understanding of how they are viewed by leadership capital in the market currently. This is saying those that are ESG specialists will be investing in companies. If you can see how that investment, what level of that investment is on a pure, highly integrated ESG metric, then you might be able to have a true interpretation of your position and your direction of travel in a way that isn't reflected in third-party agencies. So while there's many other things we could talk about, this is the thing that I think hopefully frames it for you. I'm going to say that the way this works is a classic cross-plot type quadrant-based analysis. Both of these charts say the same thing in different ways. The horizontal axis that you're looking at, if I focus on the right-hand slide there, just guide your eyes to that. Left to right is what would be represented by something like an MSCI or Sustainalytics or S&P metric or score. If you're doing well, you'd be on the right-hand side. On the left, you would be doing less well. And obviously, you know that it takes a long time to try and create that change over time, and also to be sure that what you're doing is being properly reflected in a relevant time frame. Our view is that if you look at it on the basis of investment backing by specialist investors, then that is what's represented on the y-axis, so bottom left, so bottom to top. And if over time you're able to see how that investment is moving up, then that means that you're going to see a re-rating. As ever with these charts, you want to be top right, so that you have the backing of capital and you have a high rating, or bottom left means you've got everything to do. And if you're moving between them, then of course you have an opportunity. Obviously you're moving up and to the right, great, then you're on a journey. If you're coming down on the right hand side, it could be because that capital backing is being competed away from you. And we think this is really important because this is changing the way that you look at how you assess your performance. And this is what can play into executive compensation structures. On the left there is it in numerical form. The dots are a progression over time, blue, grey to yellow, showing an improvement or a re-rating. Orange is a client of ours. They mind us using it. It's just to say that if you are improving what you're doing, if you're putting that effort into the quality of the data and the consistency of the data that you're providing, and if you're communicating that well and that's being picked up by investors, it's very likely that that is going to be reflected in that kind of move, rather than, or be a long time before it's reflected in actual third-party rating agencies. And so this is a way of challenging the way that we look at performance over time. It's going to be key because, as I say, what gets measured gets done. Companies, I find, have a very high level of conviction to be a part of this change, but what they don't want to do is to make the effort, to make the commitment, to deploy the capital, and then find that their efforts aren't rewarded or acknowledged. And so this is one other way to do that. And I think that's going to be, as I say, important for the corporate world. I think it's going to be very important for how boards assess, judge, and direct their own ESG strategies over the coming years. So with that, I would hand back to Amelia and invite any questions.
Hi, thanks, Archie. I think you've answered my question, which I had down about what can companies do to get a better understanding of where they stand. But I'm gonna rest on one thing that you said, that people didn't know what ESG was a while back. Like, what I remember speaking to a client saying, letting them know that they need to remember these 3 little letters, and they've now risen in importance. So we had a couple of questions about wondering whether we could have your presentation, which I've said that we can share that later.
Yes, of course.
If you're interested. And then I'll just say thank you for now. I think we're bang on time, actually. So we can skip over to the next part. I'll thank Chiara and Archie for this section, and I'll move over to the panel, which kind of follows what you're saying, which is about telling your story and the role of the board in this story. So maybe, Archie, can you end your screen? Actually, there are a couple of questions.
Oh.
How are small caps satisfying investor needs? Because these initiatives seem to skew towards large caps.
Yes, no, that's a fair question. It relates to the issues that I raised about a size bias involved in the challenge. It's 2 sides. It's what investors are, what those companies are doing, and then how investors are viewing those small companies. For the companies themselves, the important thing is to start. It is not to be intimidated by a whole range of different standards and frameworks that they need to conform to. Choose one, be involved in it. Maybe SASB, just begin that process. I would say think very hard about those metrics that you start disclosing, because it's important to keep that consistency over time. But just making a start is critical, and it will change the way that you interact with your investors, because they will very quickly say, great, and also say, and now do this, and they'll be part of that journey. So what small companies cannot do is to say we are too small and it's not for us. That will not work. But the other side of it, I can tell you, because I've spoken to them, investors, the large investors particularly, are very aware of this bias and this challenge, and they do judge companies are in the context of what is reasonable to expect from them, and they are trying in the main to level up that challenge.
Chiara, do you want to add something to that?
Well, just the importance of those smaller companies in the value chain. I think it's part of the journey of the whole transformation across value chain for large caps.
Okay. Super. Well, thanks, guys. Really insightful. And now let me introduce this lovely panel of distinguished panel members who are going to help discuss the importance of stewardship, engagement, and the role of the board on ESG oversight. Gillian Karen Cumberledge, founding partner of Fidelio, heading up the chair and board practice, and also a member of the Chapter Zero Steering Committee. Carol Bell, board member of Chapter Zero, as well as an independent non-executive director on a number of boards, and correct me if I've not, or forgive me if I've not got them all together, but I've got PGS and Bonner in Norway, and Tharissa PLC and Ophir Energy PLC, and the Development Bank of Wales in the UK. Natasha Martsekis, you've heard from her at the opening, but she's the Secretary General of the Non-Executive Directors Club in Greece, a non-executive member of Cepal Hellas Financial Services, and a member of the ECODA ESG Working Group. And last but not least, Bastien Dublon, Investment Director and Head of Sustainable Investing of Clim8 Invest. So thank you very much. I'm going to start saying that, you know, as ESG has been rising in prominence, it's also entered the boardroom where the need for increased focus on ESG strategy has been recognized. And for ESG to be effective, it needs to be embedded into a company's culture. And the objectives of ESG objectives should feed into strategy, and strategy should inform culture, etc. But this tone needs to come from the top, meaning from the board. So this panel aims to break down how the megatrend of ESG is shaping board behavior, effectiveness, and engagement. And I was thinking of breaking this panel down into 4 sections. The first one being ESG integration and ESG as standalone themes. So if we, and then the role of the board, walking the talk, and then engagement. So if we kick off with ESG integration, we look at these 3 little letters, as I said before, together. This is the actual megatrend, and it supersedes the rest. Companies are facing increased pressure from all stakeholders, regulators, asset owners, and society itself to escalate their ESG focus. And this is showing us that ESG is wanted by all, as it makes better investors and better companies, meaning impact matters, so does accountability for both investors and corporates. So as investors are increasingly integrating ESG into their investment decision-making, they now expect the same from corporates, like quid pro quo. So Bastien, let's start with you. Clim8 Invest. You invest in companies and funds that make a positive impact on the environment, which is great. Tell us a bit about Clim8 Invest and maybe what your investment approach means in practice and what you want to see from corporates in terms of ESG integration.
Sure, thank you, Emilia. Well, Clim8 Invest is a fintech that was created less than 2 years ago, and it was created with a very simple mission statement, which was to offer clients, retail investors, a digital platform to invest and for these investments to have a positive impact on the environment. It's the idea of that we can have both profits and be protective of the planet. And I think what was really helpful as a beginning is to have this crystal clear mission statement, because it helped to calibrate our efforts towards finding our proper ESG mantra, our proper ESG definition. And once you really know what you want to do, it is simpler because you look at what are the critical elements you need to care about. And for us, it was really the E of ESG. And I think it was highlighted by Andrew in his presentation. A lot is done when it relates to climate, but over time, biodiversity will become equally important, but the data right now are missing. So just to give you a bit of context of what we do, well, first you have to anticipate what are the upcoming regulations. So taxonomy, TCFDs, there will be others. You need to be aware of the inevitable policy response as well. And you tend to be proactive on how this policy will shape up the way you tend to look at companies. So in fact, when you think about the E of ESG, you really need to dig into this and come with your own approach, your own secret sauce, because at the end of the day, you have to look at companies and look at all these metrics in a way that is unique to yourself. And so you can be comfortable with the impact measurement and the communication you can provide to your customers. So I think, if I were to think about ESG integration, I think the most important thing is to define what is your ESG and sustainability angle, because from that definition, that you will be declining that in terms of your investment process and your approach. And I think I will stop it here on that question.
Thank you. If we move to the E of ESG, and climate risk exposure is now a major concern for all. The only way for companies to mitigate this concern is by outlining clear and long-term strategy on how they're managing climate risk across businesses. So this is a key expectation when engaging with investors, and it will only keep rising in importance. Investors will want to see companies reporting on impact, as you said, and impact initiatives, and they'll want to see ESG metrics disclosed on carbon and operations geographic footprint. Regulators are backing up this pressure. Investors are also expecting this oversight to be managed by, however, by more boards of directors, and the directors are involved in the engagement. So given the urgency of the climate threat, it can seriously influence and impact business. So they want to see it being examined from a strategic point of view. So if I take this to you, Carol, as a board member of Chapter Zero, you've created a toolkit for board members. Can you tell us a bit more about what tools board members can use to tackle ESG or climate change from a strategic perspective?
Well, one of the reasons Chapter Zero came into being as a network for non-executive directors was that a few of us, so Gillian included, realized a couple of years ago that board members really weren't very knowledgeable about climate change. And I felt very strongly, as somebody who served on the boards of oil companies since 2005 and been involved in the industry since 1980, I'm ashamed to say, so 40 years or more, a lot of people were coming back with, oh, I'm not a climate scientist, I'll never get to grips with that, and sort of put it over there and try and make it a tick box exercise. Well, the founders of Chapter Zero, the steering group, as it were, felt very strongly that we needed to help other directors to get to the starting point where they could debate climate risk at board level. And therefore, what we've been able to do is to put together content which non-executive directors can use through participating in webinars like this, but also by accessing curated content on our website to inform themselves, to get them to that starting gate, to make them confident. So we're not telling them what the answer is in any shape or form, but we're providing the right questions for them to ask at their own board in order to stimulate the debate and to do what Andrew's been talking about, and Chiara actually, which is to make it an integrated total board experience, which hopefully then permeates down the organization and allows also input from the drilling floor or the coal face, or whatever we want to describe as a metaphor, maybe not the coal face, to get that information flowing up the organization in a good way, so that the right things can be measured, the most material things can be measured, and they can be measured over time in a consistent way. So that's the ethos of Chapter Zero. I'm pleased to say, I'm sure Gillian would agree with me on this, it's the easiest thing that I've ever been involved in to try and get it off the ground, because forming it in 2019, early in 2019, we were pushing against an open door, and perversely, the lockdown has enabled our members to access that content and to learn and to inform themselves, and therefore, you know, one has confidence that now we have 1,300 members. We have directors represented on half of the FTSE 100, slightly over actually. We have some confidence that competence has been built up. We don't measure it by number of members, rather the impact they're having on their boards. So there is a way to learn. There's an awful lot out there, as I'm sure Andrew and Chiara would agree. There's a tremendous amount. But I'll leave you with an old Welsh proverb, which goes back to what Andrew was saying. You'll feel a whole lot better if you start this, basically. The Welsh proverb is, you're 2/3 of the way there the minute you start. So it's a mental thing. And for small companies and large companies alike, you know, you've got to make a start. And my view is, I've said this to a number of investors when I've been having conversations this reporting season with them, is we're not going to get this perfect the first time around. You know, we're trying to measure the most material things. It will be evolutionary because nobody knows exactly what track we're going on. But it takes more than talking about 2050. There has to be some real delivery in the next 10 years. And what I've been guiding my companies to do is to look at the deliverables in the 10-year time window and to make a start on identifying the most material things and finding a good way to measure progress.
Perfect. Thank you. I think, I mean, if there's anything good that's come out of the pandemic, it's that this is now risen in prominence from anything. So at least let's look at the little silver lining here. But then touching on the pandemic, this crisis and the pandemic has created a huge economic impact, but equally a social impact. And as a result, the S of ESG, that was the kind of the middle letter, has taken center stage now as one of the hottest topics of 2020 and 2021. So social and human justice has risen to the top of investors' agendas, and these elements are being added to their expectations on workplace standards and diversity, which is part of the forming of new skills and boards. So Natasha, on the subject of diversity and inclusion, because it's quite topical considering the audience we have, we've seen a great change in Greece recently with the introduction of the new corporate governance law, which is going to transform the profile of boards in Greece. Do you want to tell us a bit more about this, and how do you think this is going to affect the market in Greece?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Emilia, for inviting me to speak on this quite very interesting topic. You're absolutely correct. The new corporate governance law, which was voted last July, the law 4706, and will be implemented from July 21, actually has introduced a gender diversity quota in Greek boards of 25%. It was rather groundbreaking and actually attracted a lot of attention from many market participants. On the same token, the European Institute of Gender Equality officially congratulated Greece for adopting the quota in favor of the female underrepresentation on the listed company boards. But let's give the audience some perspective here in terms of numbers. We talk a lot about gender diversity, but in Greece, it has been a real issue. Greece has been ranking as one of the lowest countries in Europe in terms of female BOD members, in low single-digit numbers of 8 to 9%, and this number includes family and founder-related appointments. So if we really want to talk about the real female independent non-executive directors, the number is even lower and rather shocking. Many of the panelists today coming from the UK know very well that according to recent data published in the Financial Times, as of January 2021, there are no more all-male boards in the FTSE 350 companies. So to me, that shows indeed the way that Greece, the long distance that Greece has to cover. As a main reason for this very low number of diversity in the boardrooms in Greece, of gender diversity, it has been the traditionally very long tenures of existing all-male boards, which has really offered less and less opportunities for female board members to be considered an appointment. This has been further strengthened by the fact of the existence of unconscious biases, where really diverse board member candidates have been overlooked. Secondly, in the Greek market, there is a considerable subset of Greek companies that have been highly unlikely to accelerate refreshment of the boards due to their nature of ownership and control. Both founder and family controlled companies have been very slow in refreshing the boards, yet also they have had the highest concentration of long tenured or aging directors. So though seemingly these companies are the likeliest targets for increased gender diversity, such companies have been also, the slowest to change. Furthermore, I definitely think that poor numbers in gender diversity in the Greek boardrooms have been characterized and helped and attributed to the workplace culture, where we have seen lack of support for female leadership. Despite very long-running campaigns, women have been largely underrepresented in the executive roles here in all sectors, and obviously that can lead naturally to promotion. So I do believe that the introduction of the quota practically came to emphasize and solve the problem of the low self-regulation that the Greek companies have shown in promoting the numbers. However, on the other hand, just to be very brief, I want to emphasize here the issue of tokenism, which needs to be addressed when looking at diversity on Greek boards. And by that, to address the issue of tokenism, I mean that Greek companies should look at gender diversity as a strategic perspective rather than as a compliance issue. So adopting a merit-based recruitment decision based on a 50-50 male-female candidacy when you look at board appointments, tapping into female networks where we can find the pipeline of the next generation of female leaders are ways companies can really financially and strategically benefit from the positive contribution of female on the boards. So practically, I think that the quota mainly signaled that the Greek listed companies, they are now in a new environment where ESG practices are at the forefront of these investment decisions. So Greek companies need to move faster to achieve a real diversity in terms of board convergence. Just closing, very interesting, I've been reading recently BlackRock's stewardship statement for 2021. As a reminder, BlackRock is an institutional investor with many shareholdings in the Greek market. In their view, diverse personal and professional experiences support the mindsets that contribute to board effectiveness. So really, I expect shareholder pressure to further increase for all Greek listed companies as investors from now on will constantly challenge the ESG cultures that are leading to biases in the nomination, but also in the selection process for these upcoming critical BOD diversity positions. And I do believe that those companies that will fail to show a transparent and clear diversity strategy will be facing regulatory and market scrutiny at the end.
That's probably very true, and you're right, and it's a very interesting time to look at what's going to happen in the Greek market. But if we take this outside of Greece as well, and I'm going to go to Gillian on this, I mean, good governance is ultimately responsible for all ESG factors being implemented effectively with impact across an organization, and investors want to see governance arrangements put in place that will deliver results, and this derives from both corporate and social purpose. So board effectiveness is in the spotlight, as well as gender diversity and inclusion, and these are considered catalysts for enhancing such effectiveness, as Natasha just touched on as well. So if we take the topic of diversity and inclusion across borders, can you share some insight on how diversity looks in other markets, and what does this mean for the future of boards, and how can effectiveness, is it enhanced through this, through diversity, sorry?
Thank you, Amelia. Absolutely. It's a subject very close to my heart.
Yes.
So about 50% of Fidelio's work is in the UK, and 50% is international. We were founded about 10 years ago. So that journey that Natasha has described, we've accompanied it in the UK in terms of that diversification of UK boardrooms. My personal background is the automotive industry, and I was the most senior woman globally within Volkswagen. So I have a sort of a background of understanding some of the issues and that were mentioned. It's very clear that diversity brings benefits. It's also very clear that a diverse board needs an effective chair. So there's a couple of things perhaps to think about there. I mean, we're seeing internationally, virtually every jurisdiction is looking at increasing diversity. That ranges from the UK, that's been discussed, where we've just gone through 33% in terms of the FTSE 100 boards. And that was done really by a collaborative effort through to, there's a quota in Germany, for example. In the US, we're seeing investors, put pressure on. In India, we're seeing legislation. So almost all jurisdictions, diversity is very much on the agenda. Primarily or initially gender diversity, but we've also, another theme we haven't really touched upon during the pandemic has been Black Lives Matter, and ethnic diversity has really sort of come to the fore. And And I think, you know, there's a lot of McKinsey research, for example, which really bears out what the point that Natasha was making, that, you know, a diverse board can absolutely substantially add value to the organization, if only through thinking about risk and coming at risk from a number of different angles. I think what I'd perhaps like to leave this audience with is any of you who are sitting on boards, you have a role to play in ensuring greater diversity. And, you know, first of all, at board level, clarity about what you're looking for in a new board member will absolutely open up the route to the boardroom. And it's interesting, the debate about tokenism. I mean, if we look at gender diversity, there are enough good women. There simply are enough good women. And if one's clear about what one actually needs within a board role, that, you know, if I look at our statistics, 48% of our appointments are female and 30% are BAME. It is possible. A good governance process will get you there. And so I think at every stage of the process, really insisting upon diverse long lists, diverse short lists, clarity of that role definition are all sort of steps in terms of ensuring that you will actually get a diverse and a successful outcome. It can be done. The other thing I would suggest for anybody who's sitting on a board, if you care about diversity and inclusion, how much time are you spending in the boardroom discussing this? You know, there can be a little bit of a disconnect. And so I think boards can also be thinking about, you know, what is the visibility they have of the organization? What is the information that's coming to the boardroom? What are the levers that are available to the board? So the board can absolutely be an example and a role model, but it also has a really important role to play in terms of really, you know, opening up the organization. And as I say, I would just ask anybody who's on this call, who's sitting on a board, to perhaps reflect what their contribution is to increasing diversity.
Perfect, thank you. I think you've just helped slide into the next topic, which is actually the role of the board and accountability. I had a quote from one of our intelligence reports that we collected, which was from Tim Buckley, Chairman and CEO of Vanguard, who said in the 2020 annual stewardship report that over the past year, the pandemic, economic uncertainty, and historic social justice movements have brought ESG risks, into sharp focus. So as companies regain their bearings and plan for the future, the job of a director on the board of a public company has never been more challenging or more important. So if I could ask you again, Gillian, I mean, companies that are leading the way with dynamic reform in terms of governance, transparency, accountability, and proactive engagement will probably stand out as the ones that are able to better make informed decisions. So how can boards enhance their efforts to be able to stand out and address ESG at board level?
I mean, it's certainly a theme we've seen on, if I look at the evaluation side of Fidelio's work, over the past year, a huge theme has been really ESG moving sort of center stage into the boardroom. And I think one of the key themes, which has been picked up before by both Chiara and Archie, is that materiality. I mean, boards that get this right are able to align ESG to the business and the core business. It's not a sort of an additional silo, but it's something that's absolutely sort of aligned to the core business model. And that's really why it needs to go to the boardroom, because what we've seen over the past year is the investment decisions are becoming so material relating to ESG. Some of the trade-offs as to which direction the company is going to take, and some of the liability issues as well, you know, are so material that it has to be decided in the boardroom. And so I think, you know, the boards that take this seriously, there'll be chair leadership. I think it's really important that the chair recognises the importance of ESG. I think we're going to come to composition, but you'll begin to see some changes in the composition of the board to reflect that sort of priority of ESG. You'll see the education that Carol mentioned, you know, a real commitment to board members getting up to speed on a broad range of ESG issues. We've talked a lot about climate change. Another theme that's really core on many board agendas is the future of work. getting people back to work, the risks around that, the opportunities around that. That's a huge theme. There are liability issues, there's opportunities around that as well. And so I think there's sort of the board being able to inform itself on those issues. I think good boards will have a really clear stakeholder map. They'll understand, who are the key stakeholders for the business. They'll also understand what good engagement looks like. And I think that's one area we're beginning to see a step change in boards recognize they don't necessarily need to do all that engagement themselves, but they should have good oversight of who's doing it. And I'm seeing a shift from, well, we've got somebody in IR who does that, to actually, this is really important. They're representing our organization. We as a board need to care about that engagement. And I think that's another dimension there's been a real sort of sea change over the past year in that regard.
And yeah, we'll get to that because I have a lot to say on that one. But Carol, as an INED on a number of boards, what have you seen? What's your experience in seeing ESG rise in prominence? I mean, I know it's very close to your heart, but what has it meant for board members in terms of accountability of directors on boards?
Well, I'll go back, if I may, to my first brush with it was back in 1989 as an equity analyst at UBS, when we decided to write a big report using all of the analysts across all of the sectors across the whole of Europe on investing in a green Europe. So we were like an early version of Bastien. So 1989, that's a heck of a long time ago. And guess what? Climate change and CO2 was on the map then as well. Wind the clock forward, when I was the senior independent director of Ophir Energy, which was an oil company, being taken over a couple of years ago, Ophir, in 2016, I was chairing the Corporate Social Responsibility Committee there as well. And I said, right, we need to put climate change as a principal risk in our disclosure. And they're all looking at me, oh no, oil is going to be needed for a very, very, very long time, and all this sort of thing. So think about the context. The Paris Agreement had been arrived at a year before. So this was a trigger for me now, having been watching this forever and monitoring it and not liking what I saw, then I was able to convince my fellow board members to have it as a principal risk. And lo and behold, when we came to write the annual report the following year, the head of investor relations said to me, well, nobody else put climate risk in their annual report among oil companies listed in London. And I said, I couldn't care less. As far as this company is concerned, we need to take account of the emerging risk. And this is certainly an emerging risk. Well, by 2019, of course, it was totally in a different ballpark altogether. So it has been a journey, and things have moved through quite fast. But writing your disclosure is now almost a whole board event because of the need to join everything together, to knit everything together. So from the very front, the narrative part of the annual report, through to the last accounting note at the back, it's got to be coherent, and that's a lot of work. And when you start mapping out in the organization who's going to bring that piece of information, who's going to bring that, it starts looking like a mosaic if you start drawing it out. So Julian's point about knowing who the stakeholders are, that's incredibly important, I think, and bringing that into your thinking as well. But it really has moved mountains. And some companies have chosen to form sustainability committees. I think that's okay, but at the end of the day, that's a committee that shouldn't live for very long. It may be necessary in some companies to bring everything together fast and to have a focus for that, and then to make recommendations to the board. I'd like to think that this is right in the middle of the board agenda. If not this year, then it needs to be there pretty soon afterwards. And you may want to have a committee take some of the heavy workload and to get things done fast, but it really now is in the center of the board agenda in my book.
Perfect, thank you. And then Bastien, if we look at it from an investor perspective, I mean, it all becomes quite scientific from your end as well. This accountability relies on facts and figures. How does this translate into impact, and how do you decipher all of this from your end?
I think you have to take a step back and ask yourself, okay, as an investor, what I do is I provide capital to companies, and I want this capital to be allocated in a way that will create value over time and that will generate value as a shareholder of the company. And if you think about the role of the board with this very simple perspective, it's a mechanism of check and balances, right? And as we go forward, more and more investment decisions made by companies are overseen by the board, but they will need to consider the risk we perceive, whether it is a community risk, whether it is climate transition risk, the risk of stranded assets. I think the board actually, I think, is in a fantastic position because it can engage with investors, it can engage obviously with the executive team, but also it can provide, if it gathers all the right information, with the entire organization. And the whole idea about impact is being able to measure it. And as you are aware, as someone working in an organization, if you are capable to put the right processes, the right culture in the company, well, it will become part of your natural DNA. So you will be thinking about, okay, I'm making this investment decision at my organization level. I would consider, okay, what's my carbon footprint? How do I select my subcontractors to carry out this job? And so it's a question of when rather than how, because I think the how is gradually well identified, but it's just a question of process and make sure that all of data flows from the entire organization and is gathered by the head of divisions to the executive teams and then being overseen by the board. I think there is a natural flow of information. And it was mentioned before, know your stakeholders, and investors, they want to have their money being invested wisely. They want their money to make a return, but they want as well their money to make at some point an impact. And it was labeled in the taxonomy, do not significant harm as well. And so it's the world mission to make sure that everything is in place to, I would say, satisfy this mission that an investor is requiring, because you give capital and you want this capital to have a financial impact, but also you want this capital to have an impact on people, on the planet, and I guess every stakeholder involved in the value chain of this company. So I think it's really important that the board really forces, if it's not the case already, to have that flow of information being gathered from every part of the organization to ensure this is really part of a new corporate culture that cares about all these aspects.
Super. Thank you. I think, basically this moves again over to the next topic, which is collecting all of this information, driving all of this information for the board to be able to have such a responsibility and walk the talk, as they say. They need to be able to define the values and purposes and the actions and behaviors that companies can then engage with investors to tell the story that is being created. So Natasha, if it's up to boards to decide how far they want to go in terms of sustainability, because this is ultimately what defines and can drive a significant culture, purpose, and mission. What do you think boards need to focus on if they want to make a change?
Yes, thank you, Amelia. I will answer this question by actually agreeing totally with what Carol said about boards need to understand. So I do think that in order for boards to be able to engage and share their ESG agendas and their ESG priorities, they need to be educated, first of all, about what these ESG priorities are and how these issues are linked to the company's strategy. But I think that as ESG topics continue to grow in importance for investors, it totally falls within the board leadership premises to ensure that this topic and all related risks and opportunities are given enough time within the boardroom, as Gillian said, because we see many boards, talking about ESG, but then they don't spend enough time on ESG. Secondly, what I find very interesting is the fact that boards often think about ESG as a risk. And this kind of mentality goes down to the whole company mantra. But ESG is also an opportunity. It's all about the ways that the company can create or equally destroy value. So the board needs to believe in this kind of aspects and be able to transport them throughout the organization. So an in-depth induction for board members on ESG integration practices and an actual integration into board decision-making is of paramount importance according to my eyes. And here also comes the issue of materiality that both Carol and Gillian and Andrew and Chiara touched upon. The board needs to be actively involved in the materiality analysis throughout the whole planning process, involving all stakeholders. I think what is really important for each company needs to be seen at board level in terms of environmental, social, and governance risk. Also, another point which is interesting, according to my eyes here, is that when the board takes ESG seriously, they are very willing to be also evaluated seriously on an ESG basis. So, I would be very happy to see annual board evaluations that they are linked to ESG criteria, to ESG performance criteria, like diversity, or Gillian said about inclusion, criteria that can also be applied to board succession planning and nominations and appointments. So I do think that in order to instill this ESG mentality to all company levels, you have to really to have a bottom-up approach that really the tone is set at the top, and you set a new paradigm of acting at the board level.
And if I may add,
Thank you.
Emilia, if I may add a small comment here, because I totally agree with Natasha, and I think Carol made a very accurate point that I think needs to be a bit more emphasized. True integration does not imply an add-on sustainability committee or an add-on chief sustainability officer, which is now the #1 trend in recruitment, right? So true integration would mean that the chief strategy officer, the CFO, or the board members would have all these knowledge, understanding, and skills around all these topics, and both, again, from a risk and an opportunity perspective. So integration does not imply different type of positions or committees. All committees should have an ESG view, an ESG viewpoint, as well as board members.
I think it's more of a transformation of mentality towards integrating all of this in terms of all aspects of the business, which I mean, it's a very, very good point, because it's more about labeling something rather than what's it called, osmosis through the whole diffusing something through the organization. Gillian, I mean, for boards to be well equipped in terms of ESG, it may require transformation. It may require new skill sets via evaluations that take place. From your role within Fidelio, can you tell us about skill sets, profiles that companies might be looking for to bring in ESG into the boardroom? I mean, I think we touched on it at some point. This could involve a younger generation in some cases. What do you think companies or boards should be considering when looking to refresh their ESG mentality as well?
Thank you. I mean, it's a very good question. I guess there are two dimensions. I mean, one is just dynamic succession planning. I mean, this is actually just part of good process in a board to align the board composition to the strategy of the company. And, we're seeing increasingly sort of activists, when there's a misalignment, there's very often an opportunity for activist engagement, and that really applies to ESG as well. So if you're, publicly stating that ESG is important for the board and for the company, and yet there's no reflection of that in the board composition, that is a mismatch. And we're certainly seeing, I mean, in the board evaluations we conduct, we always look at potential gaps in the board composition. And I would say across all the different industries, all the different sectors, all the different geographies that we're working on, actually ESG is there with digital as the sort of, those are the two uppermost requirements or perceived gaps in terms of sort of the board composition. And I think, when we actually translate that into, well, what does that look like? I think boards often need a bit of a shorthand to help get there. So I think, one aspect is undoubtedly experience of ESG. And I think there is an increased demand for board members who, either in a board capacity or an executive capacity, have actually hands-on experience or practical experience with ESG and can think through some of that complexity. I think that's definitely one aspect. Interestingly, the Sustainability Committee Chair, I hear what everybody's saying. I've seen some fantastic sustainability committees. And I personally think maybe some of them will have longevity because they can link up things in a very different way across the board, perhaps from other committees. So no, they shouldn't be sort of, delegated and replacing the board. But I think particularly for a very large, complex organization, that there can be a role to play. And we're certainly seeing, as Chiara said, that there's a big increase in interest in sort of sustainability committee chairs, and similarly at executive level, chief sustainability officers. And I'd say those who are at the top of their game are really good and adding value to the organisation. I think this will bed down into the organisation as a whole, but in the meantime, that is a sort of a bit of a shorthand. And I think the other aspect clearly is sector specific. So if you're sitting on an automotive board, there'll be a different set of issues from an energy board, from a retailer, and we are seeing that there's certainly a board role that's also quite sort of sector specific as well. But that perhaps gives a little bit of a flavour, but absolutely huge interest we're seeing both on the board evaluation and on the search side for sustainability and ESG contribution at board level.
Perfect, thank you. And then this moves, it moves to what the board needs to do and how it needs to engage with investors on telling its stories and all of the and now it's engagement, which is close to my heart this time, and it's about the global economy and the environmental developments can no longer be ignored, and companies managing governance and sustainability issues can't transfer their story properly just through a box ticking exercise. The spotlight now is on engagement and telling your story and presenting it from a long-term perspective. So even last week, there was an article that was saying that in the FT that was saying that companies have started holding ESG investor days to specifically discuss their plans. And we at Velos see this issue rising as a trend. So Bastian, from your perspective as an investor, how do you engage with companies you invest in, what you want to see from them in terms of what you hear in terms of ESG integration, and who do you want to hear from within the companies that you invest in?
Okay. Well, first, as at our corporate journey is too young for us to have yet engaged with companies on a very regular and proactive basis, but I come from Lombard-Odier, where this philosophy is ingrained, and what I will try to replicate at Clim8 Invest is to bring this practice on engagement. And I think the first element that has been mentioned many times here is materiality. You need to engage where it counts, right? If you look at ESG data providers, they probably have 150-ish metrics on ESG, and you can't have in a 30 minutes to 45 minutes meeting with a company the time to review all of this, right? You have to see what is really important for the company. So that's why the SASB work is extremely important, to narrow the focus, to really understand what is material and what is not. I think, part of that, I would say what I would like to see from companies is just not try to avoid the big material issue by providing nice developments and nice storylines on nice developments such as corporate engagement with community, with reforestation project. If your job is you are a coal miner and you are selling coal to utilities, and that is hugely responsible for CO2 emissions, right? So what I would like really to see is a much stronger engagement on climate-related scenarios, because in some industries with a low carbon intensity, it's not necessarily an issue. You can be Paris compliant, you shift to 100% clean energy, you keep people working at home for 2 or 3 days a week, you limit transportation. But when you think about industries with higher intensity when it relates to CO2 emissions, you need to really address that big elephant in the room. Okay, how can I decarbonize my industry? Is it something that is achievable? Do I allocate enough R&D or budget capex to finding these solutions to decarbonize my business model and my raison d'être? So I think that part of the engagement is yet to be, I would say, sharpened, because too often you have that nice storytelling lines, but you're missing the big picture. And I would really like the company to be more proactive in just addressing the main issue when it relates, for instance, to climate change. And one thing as well, which to me is extremely important, investors have power. It is called proxy voting. And too often investors are lazy in doing the job and answering all the questions and getting an active engagement with investor relations of the companies are invested in, to really understand what's at stake with the various resolutions. But with proxy votings, you have a voice, and it's important not to leave that voice silent. And so I strongly recommend that this is really part as well of the engagement with companies.
Thank you. I mean, I think that's from our perspective. I know this. In terms of, obviously, there's index funds that are focusing on ESG and they're able to exercise their voice through their votes, as do activists. So, and I think you touched on one of our previous conversations that you obviously meet a lot of the companies that you let's say at the moment, maybe not Clim8, but maybe Lombard and Odier before, through conferences, and not necessarily the board level or a combined group. But from Velos's perspective, we know that we try to advise companies to combine the efforts. So if I move over to Carol, I mean, you're in INED, you've been a senior independent director, or you still are. I apologize if I'm not getting it right. What's your view on the engagement of how the boards you sit on engaging with investors? And do you do that in a combined fashion with an integrated team, let's say, from the company? Or do you have investors coming and asking you to engage with the board directly?
Well, certainly before every proxy vote, I try to engage with the major investors of the company, be that through chairing the remuneration committee or be that through some other capacity. And because I used to be an equity analyst, maybe I'm a natural to do this, because I'm somewhat practiced in that world. There's no question what Bastien was saying about the elephant in the room, and I'm in those industries where the elephant is very definitely in the room. That those discussions are taking place. They are taking place, and if you're a Shell or a BP or a Total or a Repsol or an ENI is very far down this track. You can diversify your business. But if you're an exploration and production company, if you basically find oil and gas and pull it out of the ground, you're in a very, very different position indeed. And those discussions are taking place with respect to investor return being delivered in a different way. So it may be appropriate in some cases to say, right, guys, no more growth, because we're complying with the Paris Agreement. We really, we've got an eye on Paris. We've got an eye on net zero. And what that means is the natural life of our assets is X, and we will be paying out to you on the following basis. Now, we're in the early days of that, but that's a trend that you will see. And it's not exactly, a sunset industry, but you will see that kind of discussion going on between companies and investors, because I've certainly been involved in a few of those in the last few weeks. Other way that it might be dealt with is, I hate to use this phrase, but in the financial crisis, the concept of bad bank developed, right? So the bad assets get put into a subsidiary, and they get run in a certain way, a responsible way that will, hopefully generate the appropriate return to shareholders, but they're effectively run down in a responsible way, rather than seeing any major investment capital going into them. And we've touched about it, but let me be very, very clear from my perspective that the availability of capital is really now contingent on what you're putting that capital to work at. So this is the first time in my working life, certainly, and I've looked back in history and can't think of any examples where the providers of capital, the investors and the banks, and the insurance companies, actually, for that matter as well, certainly pension funds, are behaving in a way that is running ahead of regulation. Yeah. So the companies don't absolutely have to do it, but if they want money, and that's what this push is all about, that's why we're all here today, is the penny has dropped, that this is now not optional in any shape or form. That if you want Paris alignment, then really you've got to start running your business and allocating capital in a way that aligns with delivering that outcome.
Super. I mean, I think you mentioned something that I'd noted during the pandemic that was advised, was given by one of the advisors, that was saying that investors now, as you say, are starting to be a lot more selective about what to keep and what not. So yeah, it's up to the company to be able to speak up and say, what have you done to be able to, why not divest from me, basically, rather, why do you keep me? So, and again, what something else that's come up is that, I mean, I took a company on a roadshow for ESG and governance related matters. And I took someone from the board, and it was a corporate governance director, and someone, and an executive director that was on the board. And the people that they met, the ESG teams, the stewardship teams within these investors, they had never met them at a conference. They didn't know what they were. They didn't know what they, they didn't know how to, they didn't know how to have the dialogue. They certainly knew how to have the dialogue. They were actually fascinated by the actual different dialogue that had taken place until that time, which is where I always think that it's a matter of bringing in boards to be more engaging, to understand and discuss the story of what's being built from the top with management. So, I mean, but that's still got a way to go. Investors are asking for this, but it's not necessarily happening fully. I mean, there was a statistic that I read in a summary that I got from you, Natasha, that was saying that there's still a lack of engagement from boards. There's only 40% of board members playing a greater role in integrating ESG into long-term strategies. How can we improve this percentage? I mean, what role should non-execs play to improve this statistic?
Well, I think that's what Julian and I are pushing hard at in Chapter Zero. Is to get them to the point where they realize themselves that it's in the company's best interest and all of its stakeholders to do this. And I think the UK does tend to be a little bit proactive in all of these things. So maybe we've moved along the track a little bit more than has happened elsewhere in continental Europe on a number of these matters. But I couldn't have predicted how fast it would have moved in the UK even. And that's very, very encouraging, I think. But it's back to that old Welsh proverb, you're 2/3 of the way there the minute you start.
But I mean, I can actually tell you all about a difference that I've seen, even in the UK, although the UK is a lot more engaging. The UK consults rather than proactively engages in dialogue. And then there's other markets in Europe that are way behind in the game. So if I were to ask you, Natasha, in terms of in Greece, what do you know, and how do you think this statistic needs to be improved? What would be your views?
Well, thank you. I think, according to my eyes, NEDs in Greece are really the gatekeepers to this effort of internalizing ESG strategy at all company levels. And I think there are a few points to make here. first of all, non-executive directors through their seat at the table can ensure like board accountability to all stakeholders by promoting stakeholder inclusiveness and engagement, by listening actively, by connecting, and by showing empathy to all related parties. A second point in terms of NED engagement, I believe it is critical, is the fact that NEDs are in the position to question regularly the company's ESG strategy and also redefine priorities and the company focus. And actually, what was mentioned about sustainability committees, I think it falls within also the NED's perimeter to question the establishment of transparent and working sustainability committees that they report directly to the board. A third point, which I really find very interesting, is the fact that non-executive directors, to my eyes, can strongly encourage boards to benchmark themselves or collaborate through informal talks with other boards that they're already in the same sector and they are already leading the way in terms of change or transformation on the ESG front. And I think on the same tone, NEDs are those who should be advocating for the integration of ESG indicators as part of the company's financial reporting. And ultimately, of course, as we discussed before, in the remuneration of executives, and why not also on the compensation of the board members themselves. A third point that I would like to make here is that we have seen the case of directors seeing ESG as a window dressing exercise, which leads obviously to what we call greenwashing in corporate governance. As I'm sure all the panelists can tell the audience, in 2020, the largest asset managers have really begun to message that they hold directors totally accountable through proxy voting, as Carol said, if they believe that the company is not making any progress to ESG reporting. And also, they are totally not going to be hesitating in voting against re-election of directors who fail to support ESG strategies at board level. Yeah. So I think with these thoughts, I will close these comments about the importance of NEDs when it comes to ESG strategy. And this ESG strategy is practically shown in the way that the companies choose to allocate their capital. And going back to Bastian's point, this is totally measurable.
I could not agree more. I think, Bastien, I'm going to put you on the spot a bit, because during our speaker planning chat, you had said that you had not actually thought or had not had the opportunity to engage with board members because you have more of a platform, if you like, during the conferences, but you found it appealing and intriguing to have that opportunity. Is this something that you would welcome as an investor? I mean, I'm trying to trigger tantalize the audience a little bit with this one.
Sure. I mean, every type of interaction with a company, whether it is at executive level, IR, board, is always welcomed. When you think about the world of investments, maybe you have very specialist investors in a large investment firm, and this is what I was at Lombard Odier. So you have very deep knowledge on a certain number of companies, that number being below 100. But then in some other asset managers, you are dealing with portfolio managers looking at 400, 500, 600 companies, and you can't engage with them all. That's, you have a time element which is missing here. So I think every type of interaction is obviously important because it helps you to better understand and appreciate a business, but you have the reality of the market. You have every new information that is priced in the share price quasi instantaneously. And so you need to really understand what you might get from a board engagement. And if I am trying to connect the dots, I think with ESG, and maybe people will call it sustainability, some of them will be more inclined to call it impact, but at the end of the day, what we are trying to do is we are trying to put in the share price some element of risk with a respect of a certain criteria. And I think in the past, when a security was moving up or down, it just because it reflected new perspectives on future earnings, or maybe there was a new contract that changed our view of the company. Right now, ESG forces you to look at the risk elements in a much more scientific way. And I think the better data we will get, and whether we will get it because it's a board push or because at the end of the day, the investor push is so strong that companies wouldn't have a choice. But at the end of the day, I think market needs to price in externalities. The key issue today is these externalities are very complex to price in, right? What will be my carbon price in 10, 15 years? Should I start to price in a carbon tax adjustment in Europe, in the US? What level? What would be, if I think about, maybe there will be other policy responses that will have a cost impact, stranded assets, for instance. How do I price in this risk? And I think the positive with ESG, it forces you to open your books and show the risks you are facing and show how you are dealing with these risks. But equally, it really belongs to the investors to think hard about this impact and how to incorporate it in the valuation of a company. And I think this is the most complicated part, is to get all this reliable data on which you can build your knowledge and then do what you are meant to do, i.e. find price misallocations or dislocation in a company's share price and consider this is a buy opportunity or not. But at the end of the day, it's all about, as an investor, about pricing in future growth, but equally being able to better calibrate all these risks, transition risk, climate risk, and you name it, they are numerous. And the role of the board is just to ensure that first, these risks are very well understood at the level of the company, and every member of the organization is aware of these risks, but also to help investors to have, I would say, a fair understanding of this risk and provide them with a fair measure on how to calibrate this risk. I think it's a key element in the way the financial industry is going to move forward.
Super. I mean, I think from, if I can just summarize very quickly from what you all said, it's a journey. You've got to start. Whatever you start, it's a work in progress. It's a relationship. It's an engagement. It's an evaluation along the way to understand where you are, how to improve, and what to upgrade. And it's about doing it all together. It's not about just labeling someone. It's about taking ownership as a company and as a philosophy and as a mentality. So if I can use all of you lovely people to then ask a final question, and not just the panelists, I'll use Chiara and Archie into this. If you had one piece of advice to share with your audience from your experience and field of work on how to incorporate ESG into the strategy and culture of an organization, what would it be? I'll start with the screen as I see it so that we don't all get confused. Carol, you're first.
Well, I think I've probably touched on this already. Make a start, realize that it's not going to be perfect, and be prepared to be iterative and communicate well with your stakeholders. Okay. It's quite a mouthful, but.
Archie, can I move to you?
Thanks. Yes, I'm going to go for two, even uninvited. So one is to understand, do the work that is required to work out how you're going to measure your performance. Right. This is. There are efforts to be made and there are initiatives to be put in place. But unless people are really clear, this is boards. Unless they're really clear about how they're going to measure that outcome, then it will be lost, and it will be lost in the culture of the business, and it will be lost in the eyes of investors. And the second one that you didn't ask for was that I would ask boards to be very critical of the kinds of advice that they take, because there is an easy solution to nearly all of these issues, which are invariably wrong, and it can involve selling an asset because it's unattractive currently. It's a difficult proposition, and how to work and improve and be part of a transition means just sell it to somebody else who will then manage it poorly, or and will hold the process back. And I think that's really the bit about where the non-executive directors really play a role. Be critical of the advice and look long term for the solutions, because otherwise you'll destroy value pretty quickly in the near term.
Okay, thank you. Bastien, over to you.
Oh, well, advice. We have to try to be humble here. Well, I will just give two. Well, first, if you really believe that ESG or impact can create alpha, i.e. help you to beat an index when you invest, well, you just can't use data on the shelf, right? You have to make this data personal. They have to reflect in what you really believe in. There's no point in claiming you can create alpha if everyone is buying more or less the same data. So I think that's point number one. Just make the data yours. And the point number two, I will reiterate, it's a journey. Accept that you don't like the results you get. Accept you might have flaws in your process. You can't be perfect day one. And accept to be transparent. I think this is probably the most important thing, because the word has been used, greenwashing. And I think at the end of the day, when you are an investor, you want to create a relationship of trust with your clients. And if you start greenwashing everything, well, you will be losing this trust relationship, because you have been providing with a fiduciary duty to manage money of someone else. So just be honest, right? I think regulation that is coming will help to avoid these pitfalls, but just be honest as well with your customers, because at the end of the day, they will lose, I would say, some faith in the merits of the ESG integration approach.
Perfect, thank you. Gillian.
Thank you. I mean, I think my one piece of advice is do not underestimate ESG. It has the power to be hugely transformational. There will be winners and there will be losers. And I think that as a board member should shape your approach, your risk appetite. We're already seeing that CEO appointments, some of the biggest CEO appointments in Europe, have had a strong ESG capacity element to them. And I think it also, picking up on the point that several people have made, you need to be able to communicate. You need to be able to think clearly about the decisions. There needs to be good decision making, and there needs to be the capability, including at board level, to communicate those decisions. And I think that's how I would, my advice would be, this is transformational. This is truly transformational.
Yara. Thank you, Gillian.
Thank you. 2 points from my side. One, bring down the silos, but most importantly, change the thought process. We need to stop thinking about outputs, whether these are products or services, and start thinking about outcomes. What is the so what effect of these products and services to your stakeholders in all these dimensions of sustainability?
Perfect, thank you. Very good advice. Natasha, last but not least.
Thank you. My main point here would be practically the fact that from a NED perspective, you have to make sure that this new ESG approach is internalized with a bottom-up approach, because we would never reach to any of these desirable results in ESG if the whole company is not embracing ESG. And obviously the tone at the top matters, but the company mentality is very, very important. So I think it's very critical for NEDs here to question and enhance the company's ESG strategies, also through inclusiveness, listening, connectivity, and empathy for all stakeholders.
Perfect, thank you. And then if I can just add my penny's worth of the last bit of advice, I think it's tell your story. Don't be shy. Build a team. Say it, and engage and speak to investors, because you may be a big fish in your own country, but you may be a small little fish in the rest of the market. So the more you speak about your story, the better it is to get heard and create and develop the relationships. And it is a journey, and it'll help all aspects, from the board to the management and everyone. I mean, from my perspective, thank you so much to everyone. I think it's been very insightful. obviously I think everyone on this panel is happy to help anyone from the audience if they have any queries or if they want to reach out on evaluations, assessments, engagements, advice, non-executive director, involvement and everything. So I'm going to say thank you very much on behalf of Velos Advisory and to all the speakers. Natasha, I think I'll leave the last word to you we're under the auspices of the Non-Executive Directors Club in Greece.
Yes, thank you. We would all like to thank you for participating in this event, which was organized by Velos, sponsored by Ernst & Young, and under the auspices of the Net Club. We do look forward to seeing you in our next webinar in our effort to better educate and promote the role of the non-executive directors in Greece. Thank you all for attending, and we will see you soon online. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Audience, thanks very much. Have a nice evening.